Rich, I think one of the, first questions of a lot of people tuning in, where was the red tie? Hi, I'm Maddie Hale, and welcome to Times Radio's The Trump Report. Well, it's the day of all days that we've been waiting for. The 47th President of the United States has officially been sworn in. Donald Trump is president for the second time. Today, we're going to be diving into all the big stories from Inauguration Day with independent political analyst Rich Rubino. Rich Rubino, independent political analyst, thank you for joining me today. We've just heard from Donald Trump's historic speech after being sworn in his inauguration in Washington, D.C. What were your immediate thoughts after this?
This is really unprecedented. There's really never been, that I know, a political inauguration speech like this. This is more of a campaign speech, if you will, by Donald Trump. He actually mentioned, for example, that he won the election and that he won all 7 swing states. That's usually something he would say at his rallies, or if he was speaking at a Republican national convention, or if he was speaking to a Republican crowd. This is not something that you normally hear. This is a very partisan, ideological speech. This is very much giving red meat, or giving red meat to his base of the conservative movement. And I think he's saying these are the people that really brought us here, without mentioning Joe Biden's name or Vice President Harris's name. Obviously, he was intimating that. So those are the big things that I took out of it. Now, in terms of the actual policy proposals, a couple of things. First of all, that in terms of the Panama Canal, this is something I think a lot of Americans thought that he was just kind of joking about, but he's actually serious about the possibility of taking back the Panama Canal. That was not an issue whatsoever in the campaign. Neither candidate brought it up, neither major candidate. So this is really going to be something, I think, 50 years down the road that historians will look at as really kind of iconoclastic.
I think the executive orders that he kind of vowed to make, I agree, they did seem like campaign promises. But Rich, from your kind of years covering this and being a political analyst, how strange was it to have Donald Trump, I guess, openly insulting the Biden administration and the Democratic Party in clear daylight in front of them right there? I thought it was such a bizarre thing to do, as Joe and Kamala are sitting right there in the front row behind him. Is this a normal occurrence at an inauguration?
No, not at all. Now, there have been examples where you've had a president leaving office and a president coming in that couldn't stand each other. For example, John Quincy Adams. John Adams actually in 1801 did not go to the inauguration of Thomas Jefferson. John Quincy Adams did not attend the inauguration in 1829 of Andrew Jackson. They obviously had a really bitter rivalry, and they had actually run against each other. In 1869, Andrew Johnson did not attend Rutherford B. Hayes's address, but it's really unprecedented. I've really never seen a scenario like this where a president delivered a partisan speech. Usually, there's generally a rule in politics. When you're out campaigning, you give a speech like this. When you're giving a State of the Union, you give a very policy-oriented speech, a few partisan barbs, but basically it's policy-oriented. And that leaves the inauguration address, usually that's very thematic, if you will. It's a speech that you talk in grand themes. You talk about our best days being ahead of us. You don't talk very much about substance. You kind of touch on it a little bit. But he really talked about substance. He talked about policies. And he criticized the policies of his opponent, and he showed off by the fact that he won a presidential election. Now, it's interesting. If you look at what we have in the United States, it's the Electoral College, which is different than the popular vote. So the Electoral College, basically each state awards their electoral votes to whoever wins the popular vote in the state. So, for example, if you win the state of Wisconsin by 1 vote, you get every single electoral vote from the state of Wisconsin, as opposed to the national popular vote. And the national popular vote, this is actually the second closest election since 1968 in the popular vote. The only vote that was closer was 2000 between Gore and Bush. So this was actually a very close election. The country is very much bifurcated. The United States Senate, there's a 6-seat majority in the United States Senate, 53 to 47. And in the House of Representatives, there's literally a 2-seat majority in the House of Representatives. This was not a decisive mandate by Donald Trump. This is very much a bifurcated election, but obviously the Electoral College magnifies it a little bit.
Rich, I think we know that Donald Trump approaches his political life very differently to how most would. in 2017, he's sworn in and has 4 years, a very tumultuous 4 years. He then loses the election, but obviously won't concede it. He then refuses to go to Joe Biden's inauguration in 2021, let alone host him for tea, him and Jill over for tea. But obviously Joe Biden and Dr. Jill invited him and Melania this morning. What does this kind of say about where we're at when you have the president refusing to host the incoming president, Joe Biden, in 2021, but Joe Biden allowing him to come for tea before the inauguration started today?
Yeah, interesting. Donald Trump did not concede the 2020 election. He believes that there was massive voter fraud, and he believes it had it not been for those votes, at least that's his rhetoric, had it not been for that voter fraud, he would have won the election. So consequently, he said he thought that he was not going to do it about face and try to say that he lost the election by conceding it to Joe Biden. So consequently, he did not attend the 2021 inauguration. Vice President Pence was the highest ranking official from the Trump administration, and he didn't attend the inauguration. If you heard the beginning of his address, Joe Biden began by thanking all the dignitaries that were in the audience, and he said Vice President Pence, but he did not mention the name of his predecessor, Donald Trump. But he did, though, and there's a practice begun by Ronald Reagan back in 1989 where you leave a note in the drawer of the desk in the Oval Office, and the next president comes, and usually you're not supposed to tell them, and they're not supposed to release this to the press, what's in that letter. And the story is that Joe Biden opened up the drawer, found the letter, and then looked to one of his aides and said, that was extremely graceful, uncommonly graceful. And he said, the aide said, well, what did he say? And he says, I'm going to keep that. That's between him and me. So my supposition here is that Joe Biden probably left a very altruistic note to his predecessor and successor, Donald Trump. And that probably something we will not find out until maybe 10, 20 years down the road, both of them, what they actually said.
It is interesting, Rich, to see kind of how those two interact with each other, because it has been a bit of a divisive relationship, and obviously traveling in the car together. I mean, everyone would want to be a fly on the wall watching these two interact in a private space together. But a lot of the commentary in this campaign and in today has been, I guess, surrounding Barron Trump going from a young boy in 2017 to 2025 when he's a young man going off to college. And NBC was saying just watching him kind of walk through just shows the passage of time. And I guess I want to know how different of a vibe is today's inauguration from that time when Donald Trump was first sworn in as president.
Yeah, well, first of all, just in terms of the trip in the car, Joe Biden is actually kind of used to this because in the state of Delaware, where he's been elected to the United States Senate going back to 1972, they have a practice that the winning and losing candidates actually they have a parade, and they sit in the car together. So Joe Biden actually did this many times after all of his victorious wins in the Senate. So he's used to this, and it'd be interesting to be a fly on the wall. Amy Klobuchar, who ran against Biden also in the Democratic primary back in 2020, was also in that car together. With Donald Trump and Joe Biden, respectively. So my guess is that she'll be asked what was said and what the conversation was, and she'll probably reveal at least a limited amount of it. In terms of what happened in 2016, the American political establishment was absolutely shocked. Donald Trump was given about a 90% chance of losing that presidential election. Hillary Clinton, for example, I think was running a front-runner strategy, which is where you essentially try to say as little as possible. To try to win the presidential race. You don't want to step on any toes when you think you're far ahead. I think she believed that she was far ahead. She landed up not even campaigning in the aforementioned state of Wisconsin, one of the critical swing states. Donald Trump went out and campaigned, and part of the reason that he won is he was able to kind of get to the left, if you will, of the Democratic Party on issues like trade. The Democrats had always been the party, usually were the party of tariffs, the party, at least going back to 1993, when NAFTA got passed, a lot of the opposition to it was the liberal Democrats. Well, Donald Trump said, there's a lot of jobs that are hollowing out. They're going overseas. I'm going to protect these jobs. So consequently, in places like Ohio, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan, which is called the Blue Wall, those were states that every Democratic presidential candidate going back to Bill Clinton in 1992 had won. He went there and said, your jobs are going overseas, or they've gone to Mexico. I'm going to bring your jobs back. and he was able to garner a lot of support from white blue-collar voters who were traditionally Democrats. They're called the Reagan Democrats. They voted for Ronald Reagan in 1984, but Bill Clinton brought him back in 92, and many of them went for Obama in both of his presidential races in 2008 and in 2012. Trump was able to bring a lot of those back, so it really sent shockwaves in terms of the political establishment that he was able to win. Now he's the establishment, and it's interesting. You come in by running against the establishment, but once you've actually been in the White House and once you've actually started many careers or continued many careers, many in the conservative high command, part of the administrative state, he's now the establishment. The establishment was Joe Biden. Now it's Donald Trump. So now it's a matter of how you operate in terms of working. Do you work in a bipartisan way? You try to get everything through with just Republican members of the House of Representatives and the United States Senate. You did see him try to cater a little to some Democrats. John Fetterman was senator from Pennsylvania. The Democrat was the first one to actually go to Mar-a-Lago, the first Democrat, and meet with Donald Trump to try to find common ground.
Rich, I think one of the, first questions of a lot of people tuning in, a lot of everyday people actually tuning into the inauguration was, where was the red tie?
That's the $64,000 question. I have no idea, but that is a great question, and I'm going to do a little bit of investigation on that.
I'm so confused. I thought maybe the red and the blue was a bit of a come together moment. The purple was the red and the blue merging together.
Democrat and Republican, right? The Democrats are the blue, Republicans are the red, and you put them together, and I guess theoretically you could have a purple tie because that kind of brings them both together, but that is a very probing question.
I've got the hard-hitting questions. I was concerned when he walked out. I was like, what precedent does this set with this purple tie? Rich, getting into those, I guess, presidential promises, I would call them, in that inauguration speech, when they were really kind of him setting up his executive orders. Now, we know that he's apparently got about 50 executive orders that he wants to sign in his first, I guess, day or so of the presidency. He made a few very bold statements. We knew he would try and tackle the border. He wants to remain in Mexico to come back in. He wants to end the Green New Deal and the electric vehicle. He wants to end D&I in schools and make it a US policy that there are only two genders, rename the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America, and of course the Panama deal that you mentioned before. This was a very bizarre list, grocery list, if you will, of things that he wants to do on day one, and they're not small things.
Yes, and it was very interesting about the Green New Deal. That's actually something, if you go back to 2020, Joe Biden did not come out as being for the Green New Deal. In fact, he was seen largely as being opposed to it. There were elements of it that he might have liked, but he was not seen as an advocate of the Green New Deal. The Green New Deal is usually advocated by the more liberal wing of the Democratic Party. Biden was always seen as kind of a center-left establishment Democrat. But I think that Bernie Sanders, for example, the senator from Vermont, Elizabeth Warren from Massachusetts, those were really the Democrats who favored that. But that being said, Donald Trump knows it's unpopular, so he tried to allegate the Green New Deal, probably inadvertently or probably intimating that Joe Biden had somehow instituted it or was in favor of it. But in reality, he disliked certain elements of it, but was actually against the idea of the Green New Deal.
Rich, we know that from the 2024 election, there was kind of so much backlash from Democrats and anyone really left-wing for using rhetoric referring to any Trump supporters as garbage or neo-Nazis or anything like that. And Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez this week said that the Trump administration was an authoritarian administration. It was going to be the 21st century fascism starting up again. I want to get your thoughts on this kind of language used from AOC, unsurprisingly, but anyone really in the Democrats. Do you think that they will learn from their loss in 2024 that kind of labeling Trump supporters or the Trump administration in this way doesn't really help their position going forward?
Yeah, it doesn't help it politically. Hillary Clinton came into that same trouble back in 2016 when she labeled half of Donald Trump's supporters as being in a basket of deplorables. Donald Trump used that to try to really galvanize his supporters, and there are still people today that kind of call themselves, say, I'm a deplorable. Their t-shirts that say I'm a deplorable, if you will. So there are a lot of people on the left wing that try to make those characterizations. When they do that, what they often do is they galvanize people to go toward Trump, or they bring people who perhaps don't really like Trump, like some of his policies, to say something to the effect of, I'm not that, I'm not a deplorable, or I'm not a fascist, and then they land up actually voting for Donald Trump. But interestingly, there is a battle royale within the Democratic Party about how to proceed for the midterm elections in 2026 and for the presidential election in 2028. There are those, Bernie Sanders being one of them, who says that the party abandoned the working class, abandoned the middle class, for example, and would probably want the Democrats to move further to the left. Then there are those like Governor Andy Beshear of Kentucky, Governor Roy Cooper of North Carolina, who probably would say that the Democratic Party needs to be at least more of a centrist type of a party that works in a bipartisan manner. They'll say they work with these are two potential Democratic presidential candidates in 2028. They might say something to the effect of, I've worked with legislatures in my state, which actually they had legislators that were controlled, legislatures that were controlled by the other political party, by the Republican Party. So that's going to be kind of the battle. I think once it gets to be 2019, you're going to see about 6 or 7 candidates from both factions running against each other.
Well, Rich, kind of on a separate scale, Donald Trump, he kind of struggled to get, I guess, music or celebrity talent to appear at rallies and various shows that he's done over the years, because there was always this backlash with being a Trump supporter, this social movement around admitting that you were voting for Trump or you enjoyed his policies. This inauguration, he has a number of huge stars. Carrie Underwood just performed at the inauguration, which received backlash. Do you think that there's a bit of a cultural shift in 2025 where people are a bit more okay with publicly admitting that they voted for Trump, given the turnout of the popular vote and just the Electoral College and how many people did actually vote him in?
Yes, and he's become the political establishment now. He's become the archetype of the Republican Party. When he ran in 2016, he was seen as an outsider. When he ran even in the primaries in 2016, he was seen as an outsider. But the fact of the matter is, he's now a former president, and he's brought in the Republican Party toward his ideology. For example, before Donald Trump ran in 2016, the Republican Party was known as a party that supported non-intervention in terms of foreign policy overseas. Donald Trump came in supported intervention rather in foreign conflicts, for example, going into Iraq. Trump comes in, says going into Iraq was a huge mistake, going into Afghanistan was a mistake, supports a more non-interventionist foreign policy. Today, most Republicans also favor that, to the point that they were opposed, for example, to giving military aid to the Ukraine. On free trade, the Republican Party, every nominee from Eisenhower in 1952 through Mitt Romney in 2012, was very much a party of free trade. Trump came in as an economic nationalist, says NAFTA was one of the worst deals ever negotiated. Now the party is more or less economic nationalism. And immigration, from Eisenhower 1952 through Romney in 2012, the party favored more liberal immigration laws and in some respects a pathway to citizenship, even though Mitt Romney was a little bit more conservative. But Donald Trump comes in, he says we're going to try to curtail not only illegal immigration, but legal immigration as well. And the Republican Party went and became very much Trump Republicans. I think the perfect example of this is Newt Gingrich, who was instrumental in getting NAFTA, this is North American Free Trade Agreement, passed with Bill Clinton in 1993 rather, and then in 1994 getting the General Agreement in Tariffs and Trades passed in the United States Congress. He now says, I agree with Donald Trump about trade.
Rich, just finally, obviously Donald Trump is now inaugurated. He's now the 47th president, but with his new administration means the end of the Biden administration and the end of an over 50-year career for Joe Biden. What do you think his legacy will be? Do you think he'll be able to shake off the last 2 years?
It's going to be a problem. He's going to be the first 2 years legislatively. When you look back at 50 years from now, he got quite a lot done, probably more for a president, legislatively significant legislation since Lyndon Johnson, who served from 63 to 69, since his Great Society. He got the infrastructure, his major infrastructure passed. He got American Rescue Plan. Now, the American Rescue Plan that he passed arguably contributed to the inflation crisis in the United States. I think that history is going to be history is really going to question whether or not that plan, whether it was worth the potential inflation, the increase in inflation, to try to get more jobs into the economy, and potentially it did that. It may have actually averted a recession, who knows? But it also created, or at least precipitated or effectuated, if you will, partly the inflation crisis. So that's going to be certainly an issue. The first 2 years with the Democratic Congress, he got a significant amount of legislation passed. The second 2 years with the Republican Congress, he was not able to get anything significant passed, except maybe a deal on the debt ceiling with Speaker of the House Kevin McCarthy, but that's something that's going to be very much seen as minutia 50 years from now. I think that he'll be seen as first 2 years as very consequential, second 2 years very much a stalemate, a lot of gridlock. And I think that his decision to run for president in 2023 is going to be seen as having deleterious effects upon the Democratic Party, because had he said, I'm not going to run in 2023, a lot of people thought he was just going to be, and he suggested this, a transitional figure. He would be a transition. If you elect me in 2020, I'm going to be in there and I'll be a transitional figure to more younger Democrats. And then if he were to run, if he were to say in 2023, I'm not going to run for president, he would have been seen more as a statesman. He would not be blamed for the loss in 2024, I don't think. But I think this way, since he did decide he was going to run and then he dropped out of the race with less than 200 days for Vice President Harris to get her name out there, is going to really not bode well for him in terms of his legacy. But it's going to be very interesting. You know, he's got two precedents here. One of them is Benjamin Harrison. Benjamin Harris, there was only one president in American history who served 2 non-consecutive terms. That was Grover Cleveland. Benjamin Harrison beat Grover Cleveland the first time in 1888, then lost to him in 1892. And when people think about Benjamin Harrison, if they remember it all, it's that he was sandwiched in between Grover Cleveland. The other way, so Joe Biden could be remembered as a person sandwiched between 2 terms of Donald Trump. The other precedent that I think he hopes for is Harry S. Truman. Truman left with a 22% job approval rating, the most unpopular president in the history of American polling. Today, he's looked upon as one of the 10 greatest presidents because history judged him a lot better than his contemporaneous critics did when he was president. So those are the 2 precedents, I think. Benjamin Harrison on the one hand, negative. Harry S. Truman on the other, positive. My guess is it's going to be somewhere in between.
Well, I guess time will tell. Rich will be watching to see how people start perceiving him as the years goes on, and the Trump administration, I'm sure, will be nothing but entertainment for us political junkies. But Rich Rubino, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you so much for having me on. Greatly enjoyed it.